Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's RANT webinar on Bright Talk. Very happy to have so many of you here to join us this afternoon. A couple of bits to run through before we get to the main event. First off, the title of the presentation is going to be Bring in the Cavalry by the wonderful Ben Miller from IDEXI. The summary of this one is the classic cybersecurity architecture relies on gathering huge amounts of information and using expensive technology and even more expensive people to find the occasional needle in digital haystacks. This cannot scale to match the exponential growth of tomorrow's problems. There has to be another approach. Will today's users be tomorrow's knights in shining armor? Thankfully, we have exactly the man for the job to come and explain this to you, but we have a couple of bits we have to get out of the way first. To kick off with, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask throughout the presentation for Ben or the IDEXI team, please feel free to write them in using the box on the right-hand side. We'll try and get to them during the presentation, but if we don't, then we'll answer them at the end, so don't worry about that. Next up, feedback is very important for these kind of things, so please make sure that you jump on and leave a couple of stars to decide what you think of it. Hopefully good, but if bad, let us know. Next up, attachments. There's going to be quite a nice background bit on IDEXI that you can download at your convenience. It's a PDF document which you'll be able to find on the right-hand side. It gives a good little bit of background on what they do and how they can help. Finally, there's going to be a couple of votes in this presentation to make it nice and interactive. So if you'd like to join in and get involved in that kind of thing, when the relevant slide pops up on the deck, make sure you cast your vote. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to the wonderful Ben Miller. Ben, could you give us a bit of background about yourself and IDEXI?
Hi, Tom. Thank you very much. Very pleased to be with all of you. IDEXI is a cybersecurity technology company. We are very successfully delivering what we refer to as personalized user-centric security, and you'll understand what we mean by that by the time we get to the end of the presentation. The company has around 100 customers or so, mostly large enterprises, and many of those in the Fortune 500, so well established and growing fast.
Great to hear. Cool. So without further ado, I think it's time to begin the presentation as the last few people trickle in to watch. Ben, if you'd like to crack on.
Thank you very much. Well, as Tom said in the brief, bring in the cavalry, we have a problem. We have a problem in cybersecurity today. So there is a standard architecture for cybersecurity, and it looks like this. You have a SIEM, which is a platform for sucking in a huge amount of information from your network. You have some type of smart software running over that. And then you have a bunch of SOC engineers, Security Operations Center engineers, who have to work out how to drive that technology and that information. A huge amount of information goes into those systems. A huge amount of expertise and cost goes into managing those systems. And there is a real issue with scaling those. One question I'd like to quickly ask as part of this, and as I get into the details, do you, in your organization, have a SIEM and a SOC as a part of your cybersecurity solution, whether that's in-house or outsourced? So Tom will kick that off, and over the next minute or two, if you could let us know, that'd be brilliant.
Okay, audience voting is now open. Please feel free to cast your votes. So we've got this SIEM, we've got this SOC. I've claimed it's expensive. The problem is, it's not just expensive now. There is an exponential growth of attack vectors, an exponential growth in data that a SIEM would need to process. And that growth is increasing for a number of reasons. One is the number of tools we are using to access our data, our companies, is increasing. The number of things you use today, applications compared with 5 years ago, is very significantly increased. The connectivity has, of course, increased. The cloud access, web access, mobile access, and so on. There are many more ways of accessing the same applications. And of course, a piece which is very clear to everyone, the attackers are, of course, increasing. They are seeing more and more opportunity. They are seeing more and more weaknesses which they can attack. If you look at the current scaling of any given SIEM, in general, most companies are seeing a 30 to 50% increase in data being fed into their SIEM each year. And that's without adding too many more applications. That's just trying to keep up with the current behavior. So it's a real struggle. But here's the thing.
if you actually look at the data that's going into that infrastructure, the vast majority of it is fine. It's not your problem. You don't care about the things which are all safe and hunky-dory. And most of that behavior is repeated day after day after day. The same people, the same devices, the same systems are doing the same thing every day. But it's this huge amount of normal and repeated data which is making the entire architecture and the identification of real breaches increasingly challenging. And as I say, as the scale increases, it's getting even harder. What that means is you now have an absolutely phenomenal amount of data within which to find those very rare but critically important needles in your cybersecurity haystack. There are four specific problems. Oh, I beg your pardon. We have another poll. So, second question I would like you to respond to, and this will be quite relevant as you'll see as we go through. Are your users positively engaged in cybersecurity? So if you are a cybersecurity leader or a member of the cybersecurity team, I'm sure you have an opinion on this. Are your users in general engaged in a positive way with cybersecurity? If you're not part of that team, but you're interested in cybersecurity, you can equally judge, do you think the people in your organization are thinking about cybersecurity or aware of it each day as they act and as they action their various activities? So please let us know whether you think your organization has users who are positively engaged in cybersecurity.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. The poll is now open, so please feel free to pass on your votes.
Great. So there are four big problems with the current architecture caused by the scaling. The first one is quite simple. It's cost. A SIEM is expensive software. You often pay by the data, the terabyte. The infrastructure, the physical kit that you have to run that on costs money. You will also find that even if you outsource this, you're paying a lot of money for it because obviously the outsourcing organization has to pay for that as well. Perhaps more expensive in some senses than the technology is that SOC team. SOC engineers are among the hardest to recruit today. And when you do recruit them, they tend to leave after a relatively short period of time because somebody else offers them a lot more money. So it's a real cost issue to build and maintain a SIEM, and particularly to scale it. Second issue is time to resolution. One of the obvious problems when you have a huge amount of data and a limitation in technology and people is that the amount of time it takes to follow up the various alerts you have and determine if there are real problems can be quite extensive. Extensive because there's research to do, and extensive because there's so many alerts it might take days or weeks to get to them if they are addressed at all. Third problem. When you do identify something you think is a problem, almost invariably there is somebody in the organization or some bodies who have to be part of the discussion. The security team can't simply fix it. Something has been installed somewhere, someone has accessed something, some credentials have been compromised. Somewhere in the user community you have to engage. And in today's world, it's all too often the case that if the security team, if the IT team calls up the general user, firstly, they're not a welcome interruption in the day. And secondly, the communication is often in different languages. And I don't literally mean different languages, although that can be the case with multinational businesses. But I mean the way in which the security team will communicate about the issue is not typically in the language of your average user. And that leads to a combination of frustration and further delays. And behind all of this, you have the issue that fundamentally your users are not switched onto, not engaged with, not aware of cybersecurity. They are blissfully unaware of what's going on behind the scenes and constantly making mistakes, which frankly all of us make, even security experts, but they have no awareness, no visibility, and no real interest, no matter how many times you try and engage them on it. So those are the four big problems with the current architecture: the cost, the speed to resolution or even identification, the communication of the users, and the lack of user engagement. So what is the answer? If you've read the brief that we had at the beginning, you will know that the answer is user-centric security.
Are you on the line there, Ben? Unfortunately, I can't really hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, brilliant. So user-centric security has two features: detect breaches at the user and application level and make the user part of the identification and remediation process. The first of these, detect breaches at the user and application level. If you compare with a classic SIEM architecture, the classic SIEM has a huge data lake of unstructured data. You don't actually know what's in there. You just look for patterns. And while that can be effective with some clever AI, it does mean that you're operating somewhat in the blind. So instead, we need to detect breaches based on individual users and individual applications. The second thing we need to do is make the user part of the identification and remediation process. You do have a situation where threats are scaling, and no company wants to scale its cybersecurity investment to match the speed with which the threats are scaling. But all businesses, or certainly any growing business, is scaling its employee team. It is scaling and increasing the number of people in the company. Therefore, if we can make them part of the process in an effective and efficient and useful way, then we can significantly increase the resources available to cybersecurity. Think about this idea of detecting breaches at the user and application level. The user is accessing a whole number of applications every day. They can be obvious things like email or collaboration platforms or ERP platforms. They will be solutions which are specific to an industry or even unique to a particular business. They are accessing through any number of endpoints and access mechanisms, and with the same 15 minutes, you can be in 2 physical locations or even more. You can use 3 or 4 separate devices or channels to communicate with your applications, and you could access 3 or 4 or 5 applications. If we look at what every user is doing within every application, we can build a profile for what that user's normal behavior is in that application. And this is crucial. You can't assume that simply knowing how an application is generally used is sufficient. You can't assume that the corporation's normal behavior patterns are sufficiently accurate. And you can't even just assume that the behavior of a particular device that the user uses is sufficient, because these things are very varied and quite wide. But if you know that John uses his email at certain times of day, and when he's using his email, he typically uses certain devices at a certain time of day, typically from certain locations, and when he's using his email, he typically navigates through certain folders, then you get a really close idea of that individual. And if Jane is a road warrior who's constantly abroad using her email from multiple different devices or places, we can also build up a profile of how she uses the platform, even if that is a much more varied pattern. But in both cases, by building up the individual user's pattern of behavior based in that particular application, it becomes extremely, well, I'd say extremely, it becomes much more possible to identify things which are a real breach as opposed to just a little bit different from the way the rest of the world does stuff. Lastly, we can take account of context. With a given user, we know that they can't log into 2 separate applications from 2 separate physical locations simultaneously. We can identify that as a flaw. We can see what they've done today and what they did a couple of hours later, and if they do those from places which are not within traveling reach, again, we can identify issues. So by really understanding the application, understanding the user, understanding the context, you can provide a hugely more accurate identification of the problem. Now that's really interesting, because if you know what the problem is in a very concise and clear way, you don't need SOC engineers to evaluate it to decide whether there's a problem. Instead, you can take that information and you can address a question directly to the people who actually understand the answer. Those people being the users. So if John or Jane or anyone else does something a little bit unusual, something out of character for them, then we can identify it. If John is in Edinburgh for the first time and accesses his email from OWA up there, which he's never done before, we can simply send him a communication saying, hey, John, you've just accessed your email in a way which is unusual. Is that you? Are you in Edinburgh? And he can say yes or no, and he knows the answer to that question instantly. It's a very simple question for him to answer. It's a very hard question for anyone else to answer, but it's very simple for him. And we can ask the same question if someone's collaboration folder has been shared in an unusual fashion. Or we can ask the same question if someone's ERP account has been accessed or behavior within that account has been performed in an odd way. We can say to the user, in user-centric language, in the words they understand, is this a problem? You happen to know the answer. You tell us if it is a problem or not. By doing that, we can genuinely and realistically relax quite significantly in terms of a whole area of breaches. You don't have to be concerned that hyperconnectivity is a challenge. You don't have to be afraid of the big bad OWA, which many companies feel the need to block because of the security issues and so on. Instead, if you know that whenever an application is accessed in a way which is suspicious for that particular user in that particular context, and you know if that's identified, that particular user is going to help you answer the question, then you've moved from a situation where you are very, very worried about that hyperconnectivity to a situation where you can be a lot more relaxed about it. And ultimately, you have now, I beg your pardon, ultimately you have now created an army of cybersecurity empowered, engaged individuals to support you. So let's pick a particular example there. One of the biggest cloud applications today is Office 365. It's not the only one. There's plenty of other significantly widely used cloud applications. So if your organization is a user of cloud applications or considering being a user of cloud applications, or even using on-premise applications but with remote access through things like web interfaces, do you have significant security concerns about access to those applications? Not about the back-end data storage, but do you have concerns about access to those from the cloud? Please vote if you would.
Great. And for this one, if you could write them in the form of a question with a yay or nay, that'd be greatly appreciated. So just go to the question angle, go to the poll, and say yes or no. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. So we have identified the fact that we can now communicate with our users in a sensible and intelligent, coherent fashion to give them information that they can act on straightforwardly. We now have this army of engaged cybersecurity individuals, people who understand it and care. And that brings us back to the 4 problems we saw earlier on. So how do we address these problems now? Well, in case of our first problem, the cost of the SIEM architecture, we have significantly improved that because our users are going to be the people who identify whether or not this issue is real. You don't need the SOC to be telling you, asking the question. The question can be asked simply, straightforwardly, and intelligently. And it can be asked in user language, and it can be asked only when it's a real question because we've got such accuracy based on our user-centric and application-centric view of the world. Speed to resolution, of course, is going to be much faster because if a user gets a message within a few minutes of a potentially suspicious activity, they can respond within seconds, and you can immediately address it. Because if you've got users validating an action as a real breach, then of course the security team can instantly react to it. They don't get many of those, but they can now act. The communication between the security team and the users is naturally improved because the user is able to see user-centric information. The user is able to communicate from the user to the SOC rather than the other way around. And lastly, instead of having a group of users who are oblivious to cybersecurity, a group of users who haven't really thought too much about it, and don't think about it, you now get a group of users who are actually conscious of cybersecurity because when something happens, which is a breach in their account or a mis-sharing of their applications or something, they are told about it and they respond to it. So I would posit that if you bring the user into the environment, if you scale your application scale your security environment by bringing the users in a user-centric and application-centric fashion, then the cavalry has arrived. And that cavalry is, in fact, your users.
Great. Ben, thank you so much for that. Are we now going to move on to some questions and answers?
Yes, very happy to do that.
Perfect. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask from Ben or the IDEXI team, please feel free to write them in now. While people are typing those in, I'm just going to do a quick reminder that you can download a little bit of a fact paper on some background, the IDEXI platform overview, which can be found under the attachments tab, which you can download at your convenience. Likewise, if there are any questions from the audience, please submit them now. Otherwise, we will probably end the webinar.
Well, so the one question that I think might be worth addressing just here, Tom, someone asks, so how do you do it? Which is a very fair question. The conversation so far has really been about the high level, what is the philosophy, how we're trying to do it. How we do it is more of a product pitch, which we haven't really got time or the material to jump into, but it is there in some of the attachments. And if you would like, I'm very, very happy in a quick conversation to explain to anyone a bit more detail about actually how do we do this, what's the technology, how do we hook in to the right information, how do we process that information, and how can we be sure that we get only valid, accurate alerts coming out of the system. So I appreciate you asking, and sorry for ducking it, but please do get in contact after for more information on that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Ben. I've actually sent up a little announcement to everybody who's currently watching. So if you would like to get in contact with Ben directly, his email address is now on your screen, so you can contact him there. I guess without further ado, that will call us for the day. So please feel free to drop Ben a message at any time. Ben, thank you so much for coming to join us for this one. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. And thank you to everyone that's come in to watch and will watch over the coming hours and days. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar soon. Many thanks, everyone.